The Flaxborough Horticultural Society's Spring Flower Show had always prided itself on its sense of proportion. Unlike the summer fete, with its donkey rides and rather too ambitious attempts at maypole dancing, the spring show was a calmer affair. There were no raffles of dubious legality, no overexcited children running amok with toffee apples, only the respectable sound of teaspoons against china cups and the quiet murmurs of middle-aged ladies contemplating the merits of pelargoniums over pansies. It was, in short, precisely the sort of event that nobody ever expected to be in the newspaper. Yet it was here, on a mild Saturday afternoon in the town hall's draughty assembly room, that something occurred which was later spoken of in the snug bar of the Royal George, in the aisles of Clegg's Grocers, and even, though with somewhat less relish, in the pews of St. Saviour's. The flower show had been moving at its usual glacial pace. Mrs. Emmett, the Society's chairwoman, was rehearsing for the 20th time the announcement of the winners of the best arrangement in a teacup competition when a small but noticeable disturbance broke out near the long trestle table reserved for orchids. A cry, half-gasp, half-theatrical shriek, escaped from Mrs. Barbara Pallithorpe, a widow of some 14 months' standing, who had been surveying an unusually spindly specimen of Cattleya. Those nearby rushed forward, or at least leaned forward, with the reflexive avidity of people who had very little else to distract them. Mrs. Pallithorpe, a woman of tidy figure and rather unyielding hairstyle, stood pointing at the floor. There, beside her patent leather handbag, lay a pair of spectacles. Not the dainty sort one might associate with embroidery, but thick, round and rather dark-lensed, the kind of spectacles that suggest either the frailties of eyesight or the eccentricities of character. The odd thing, at least to Mrs. Pallithorpe, was that they were not hers. "They were not there a moment ago," she declared, with the rising certainty of one who sensed the spotlight. "And I should know, for I have been standing in this very spot for the last quarter of an hour, waiting for someone to explain how this orchid can possibly be judged meritorious when it looks no more alive than the lettuce at the co-op." This pronouncement might have drifted into the usual abyss of parochial bickering, had not Mr. Norman Gribble, the town clerk, bent down, examined the spectacles with a degree of bureaucratic solemnity, and remarked in a carrying voice, "They are most decidedly of a gentleman's style, and—" He turned them over in his hand. "They are broken. One of the arms snapped clean through." A small thrill went through the crowd. For in a town such as Flaxborough, a broken pair of spectacles discovered in suspicious proximity to a widow was every bit as scandalous as a body in the library might be elsewhere. Mrs. Pallithorpe, recovering her breath, placed a hand to her bosom. "How extraordinary! I could have sworn I felt something brush against me only a moment ago. At first, I thought it must be some clumsy fellow passing by. But perhaps, oh dear, perhaps there has been an attempt." Her voice dropped on that last word, so that those nearest had to lean closer to hear, while those further away instantly filled in the ellipsis with darker imaginings of their own. Mr. Gribble straightened up. He was a man who enjoyed nothing more than the chance to appear decisive in front of an audience. "We had better have this reported, Mrs. Emmett. There may have been—" He hesitated, groping for the right word, and found the most bureaucratic one available, a misdemeanor. Mrs. Emmett clucked and waved her arms at the Society's secretary, who was already scribbling in her minute-book as if documenting the first shot of a battle. It was then almost on cue that Inspector Pubright appeared. He had not, of course, been summoned. He happened to be strolling through the square, indulging what he liked to think of as his police presence, when he noticed the slightly unusual bustle in the hall. Entering with his usual quiet affability, he found himself immediately regarded as the most appropriate person to pronounce upon the discovery. The inspector was a tall, mild-looking man whose air of patience frequently gave people the mistaken impression that he was slow. His smile, which hovered somewhere between sympathy and amusement, reassured the nervous and faintly unsettled the guilty. "Ah," said Pubright, peering down at the spectacles that Mr. Gribble was holding out to him as though they were crown jewels. "Someone's mislaid their glasses, has he?" "They are broken," Mrs. Palathorpe insisted, and dropped in the most pointed manner imaginable. "Do you not think so, Inspector?" Pubright bent down, retrieved the severed arm of the spectacles and studied it for a moment. "Pointed, Mrs. Palathorpe? Well, I should hardly like to speculate on the intentions of a pair of spectacles." A ripple of laughter moved across the gathering, though one or two of the ladies were quick to suppress it, lest they appear frivolous in the face of possible crime. The inspector pocketed the broken lenses, thanked Mrs. Palathorpe for her alertness, and murmured something about making enquiries. He then ambled away towards the tea-urn, leaving behind an audience that was, if not reassured, at least more delightfully unsettled than it had been all afternoon. For it was one thing to lose a pair of spectacles in Flaxborough. It was quite another for Inspector Pubright to take them away. By the following morning, the spectacles had become the most discussed object in Flaxborough since the unexpected arrival of a mechanical digger outside the Methodist chapel 3 years earlier. Mrs. Palathorpe, naturally, was at the centre of things. She had spent the evening retelling her account at least 4 times, first to Mrs. Ackroyd, who shared her bench at St. Saviour's, then to her neighbour across the hedge, then to her niece by telephone, and finally, with a flourish, to the manageress of the haberdashery while purchasing elastic for her late husband's trousers, which she was still altering for her own wear. Each retelling grew in colour. By Sunday night, the unseen figure who brushed against her had become a lurking presence. By Monday morning, he, or occasionally they, was a prowler. The town did what it always did best. It embroidered. At Clegg's grocer's, the talk among the queue suggested that the spectacles might belong to a stranger. "Not local," insisted Mrs. Tubbins, who had a way of declaring things as fact whenever her own knowledge was at its vaguest. "Never seen anyone about town with glasses like that. Foreign-looking, if you ask me. Those dark lenses, Italian." Behind her, Mr. Craggs, the retired postman, took a different line. "They'll belong to someone as doesn't want to be recognised, that's my guess. Dark lenses, secretive. Could be one of them council fellows, or worse." He tapped his nose knowingly, though what worse might entail was left to each listener's imagination. At the Royal George, the landlord passed the story on to the evening's first customers. With such solemnity, one might have thought he was reporting a shipwreck. "Dropped right beside her handbag, so she says. Inspector Pubright took 'em away in his pocket, didn't he? Well, what does that tell you?" What it told his audience was that something far darker than a lost pair of spectacles must be afoot. By the third pint, the consensus had hardened into the view that the widow Palathorpe had narrowly escaped being struck over the head. By the fourth, that someone had already tried, but the inspector was suppressing the fact to avoid panic. Even at the council offices, a place normally immune to drama beyond the misplacement of a stapler, speculation bubbled. Mr. Gribble, relishing his role as chief witness, described the incident with solemn relish. The inspector pocketed them with the gravest look upon his face. He intoned to Miss Teasdale, the typist. "Gravest, I said to myself, Gribble, this is no trifling matter." Miss Teasdale, who had a weakness for melodrama, sighed. Poor Mrs. Palathorpe, a widow too, and just when she was beginning to look more cheerful. It was not only the public that indulged itself. Sergeant Malley, Purbright's earnest but occasionally overzealous subordinate, approached his superior on Monday afternoon with a report. "Sir, I've made some inquiries round the opticians. No one admits to supplying spectacles like those, not in town anyway." Said Pubright, whose attention seemed to be on the steam rising from his teacup. "Perhaps they came from a distance. Then?" "Just what I thought, sir. A stranger, someone come in for mischief." Pubright nodded slowly, though whether in agreement or mere politeness was unclear. He had, in fact, already spent an hour turning the spectacles over in his hands in the privacy of his office. The lenses, though tinted, were not of the fashionable sort. They were rather practical, the kind one might expect from someone with delicate eyes or unusual sensitivity. The break in the arm was not, to his eye, entirely fresh. Yet it was the faintest trace along the inside of the case, an imprint, almost a shadow, that lingered in his mind, a mark of powder perhaps, or something rubbed away. He had said nothing of this to Mally, and certainly not to the gossiping town. Instead, he merely set the spectacles on the corner of his desk, where they sat like a patient reminder. Meanwhile, Mrs. Palethorpe found herself basking, albeit modestly, in her new notoriety. Her late husband, a solicitor of punctilious habits, had always kept her firmly on the margins of social notice. Now, for the first time in her life, she was an object of collective fascination. And though she murmured about her nerves and the fright she had endured, she accepted each sympathetic visit with a glow of satisfaction. What she did not mention, what she kept to herself, even as the town embroidered its theories, was that she had, quite unmistakably, seen a figure moving away through the crowd at the flower show. A figure that walked with a slight stoop, as though trying to be smaller than he was. It had not seemed important at the time, but now, each night as she settled alone in her neat bed, the image returned to her, clearer and heavier. And Inspector Pubright, who had observed her carefully as she recounted her story, had noticed the smallest pause before she declared she had no idea who might have owned the spectacles. Inspector Pubright had long cultivated the art of moving through Flaxborough without ever appearing to hurry. It was an art that reassured the townsfolk who disliked fuss, while at the same time enabling him to hear more than they realized he had heard. By Tuesday morning, when the flower show gossip had reached a condition of full ferment, he began his inquiries in a manner that looked suspiciously like a stroll. His first call was upon Mrs. Emmett, chairwoman of the Horticultural Society. He found her in her front parlour, presiding over a tea-tray with the same sense of imperious duty with which she presided over chrysanthemums. "Well, Inspector, I cannot say I am surprised," she announced, after recounting the incident for the fourth time that morning. "The flower show is becoming more difficult to administer every year. People bring in plants that do not meet the regulations, they hover about the judging tables, and now they drop suspicious articles on the carpet. It is most trying." Pubright accepted his cup of tea and asked mildly, "Did you happen to notice anyone near Mrs. Palethorpe just before the discovery?" Mrs. Emmett pursed her lips. "Only half the town, but if you mean anything unusual, there was that man with the raincoat. Tall fellow, rather stooped. He smelt of mothballs. I assumed he was connected with one of the exhibitors. Such people rarely understand how to conduct themselves." Said Pubright, stirring his tea with deliberate slowness. "And you wouldn't recall which exhibit he seemed most interested in?" "The orchids, naturally. They attract all sorts. People with more money than sense, in my opinion." Leaving Mrs. Emmett to her grievances, Purbright's next visit was to the town clerk's office. Mr. Norman Gribble, who had been the first to handle the spectacles, received him with evident pride. "I thought at once, Inspector, that this was something beyond the ordinary," Gribble said, producing his account in tones more suited to a coroner's jury. The widow Pallithorpe was quite beside herself, poor lady. I saw at once the fracture to the arm of the spectacles and concluded that they had been deliberately broken. Deliberately? Pubright raised his brows politely. Oh, undoubtedly. You can tell these things, you know. A natural break would have shown splintering. This was clean, intentional. The inspector murmured something appreciative and allowed the clerk to bask in his own deductions, while privately noting that the man's enthusiasm for melodrama exceeded his skill in optometry. From there, Pubright ambled towards the modest semi in which Barbara Pallithorpe had chosen to pass her widowhood. She received him in her sitting room, which was furnished with the exact neatness of someone who feared that a late husband's ghost might reprove any dust. "Oh, Inspector," she sighed, smoothing her skirt. "I am still quite shaken. Imagine a woman alone suddenly confronted with, well, goodness knows what wickedness." Pubright inclined his head. "A disagreeable experience indeed, Mrs. Pallithorpe. I wonder, though, you were standing close to the orchid table, I understand?" "Yes. Such dreadful plants, orchids. So sinister looking. Yet I am always drawn to them. I cannot think why." "And in that moment, when you discovered the spectacles, did you happen to notice who was nearby?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering towards the lace curtains as though to check whether they could overhear. Then she shook her head briskly. "No one of consequence. The whole thing happened so suddenly." Pubright smiled gently, as if to thank her for even that much, though he noted again the fractional pause before she spoke. Later that afternoon, the inspector sat opposite Sergeant Malley in the police station's modest office. The spectacles lay between them. "Well, Malley," said Pubright, "it seems that half the town was within 5 yards of Mrs. Pallithorpe when she cried out, which narrows the field considerably." The sergeant frowned in puzzlement. "Narrowed, sir?" Pubright leaned back. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, anyone who goes entirely unnoticed is often the most interesting person in the room. We shall have to look for the one who avoided being mentioned." Malley scratched his head, uncertain whether this was wisdom or whimsy, and chose not to ask. Pubright tapped the broken spectacles once with his finger, then set them back on his desk, as though reminding himself that for all the town's embroidery of theories, the object itself had not yet explained its story. The inspector closed his notebook with deliberate care. "Tomorrow, Sergeant, we'll speak with the optician. A pair of glasses like these, tinted and heavy, will have left its trace." By Wednesday afternoon, the town of Flaxborough had achieved the enviable state of being quite certain about something it did not understand. Certainty was a civic habit. It gave people a sense of dignity in a world that otherwise offered little more than railway timetables and the co-op dividend. The certainty in this case was that the broken spectacles must belong to Mr. Percy Winstanley, the proprietor of the local photographic studio. Winstanley was a small, nervous man whose black hair had been lacquered into a permanence of style, not unlike a coal scuttle. He was known for wearing tinted glasses indoors, supposedly to protect his eyes from developing fluid, though more cynical townsfolk hinted that he wore them to look artistic. He had also been spotted at the flower show, hovering about the orchid table with a notebook, as though the blooms might pose for him if asked politely. It was not long before this information had merged, through the alchemy of repetition, into accusation. By the time the council assembled for its weekly committee session, Mr. Winstanley had been all but convicted. Councillor Chubb, a butcher by trade and a man convinced that criminal intent could be recognised by posture alone, thumped the table. Always said there was something peculiar about that fellow. Staring at people, scribbling notes. These artistic types, they live outside normal rules. Mr. Gribble, who saw the meeting as an extension of his own role in the spectacle affair, cleared his throat. I distinctly recall that the broken spectacles were of a kind favoured by Winstanley. Round, heavy, rather funereal. It would be irresponsible not to consider him the prime suspect. There was a murmur of agreement, broken only by Councillor Sweet, who managed the town's drapery shop. But what precisely would he have been attempting? We mustn't leap to conclusions. Attempting? Cried Chubb. Why, to assault the widow, of course. Prowlers don't attend flower shows to admire begonias. It was at this point that Pubright, who had been invited to sit in the corner of the chamber as a mere observer, coughed softly. The sound, though mild, had the effect of halting the councillors mid-flow. "If I may, gentlemen and lady," he said with his usual courtesy, "there's no evidence at present that the spectacles belong to Mr. Winstanley, nor indeed that they were dropped with any particular malice. The break in the arm is not recent." Chubb snorted. "Well then, Inspector, how do you explain the widow's fright?" Purbright's expression remained serenely patient. "I should not presume to explain Mrs. Pallithorpe's emotions. They are her own. But as for the spectacles, it would be premature to attach them to any one person." This deliberate refusal to satisfy the appetite for a culprit left the councillors vaguely discomfited. They preferred their criminals defined, preferably with names and addresses attached. Nevertheless, by the following day, Sergeant Malley had dutifully brought Mr. Winstanley to the police station for what was described, with bureaucratic politeness, as a friendly interview. The photographer entered looking as though he were about to be framed for treason. His dark spectacles, an intact pair, not broken, glinted beneath the station lamps. He twisted his hat in his hands while Pubright invited him to sit. "Mr. Winstanley," the inspector began, "I understand you attended the flower show last Saturday?" Yes, indeed, Inspector. A marvellous event. I took notes for my own artistic reference. The composition of orchids, you see, it inspires one." "And might I ask," Pubright continued, "whether you mislaid a pair of spectacles on that occasion?" Winstanley looked startled. "Spectacles? No, certainly not. I have but the one pair, very expensive, specially tinted for my eyes. I guard them carefully." Pubright placed the broken lenses on the desk. "Not yours, then?" The photographer recoiled as though they might be infectious. No, not mine. Ghastly things, cheap, quite unlike mine." Pubright regarded him kindly. "You'll forgive me, but some of the townsfolk were of the impression you might be their owner." "People will say anything," Winstanley protested, his voice trembling. "They resent an artist in their midst. They laugh at my work. But I tell you, Inspector, I have never harmed a soul. I was merely sketching orchids." The inspector's gaze lingered for a moment, not unkindly. Then he nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Winstanley. That will be all for now." When the photographer had scuttled away, Pubright leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Well, Malley," he said, "it appears Mr. Winstanley is guilty only of eccentricity, a common enough affliction in Flaxborough." The sergeant looked doubtful. "But surely, sir, the glasses do look like his." Pubright smiled faintly. "In a town of this size, Sergeant, resemblance is often mistaken for evidence. We must be patient. The truth will usually announce itself, but only if we refrain from insisting too loudly upon it." And, with that, he returned the broken spectacles to their patient vigil on his desk, leaving them to await the moment when they would speak more clearly. The Thursday afternoon lull in Flaxborough was one of Inspector Purbright's preferred hours. The bustle of the morning market had subsided, council clerks were only half pretending to finish their paperwork before tea-time, and the town seemed to breathe out a long sigh of routine. It was in this atmosphere that Pubright chose to walk, slowly and apparently without direction, towards Mr. Scroggins's optician's shop on the high street. Scroggins was a man of considerable girth and limited patience, whose pince-nez gave him the look of a walrus attempting to pass as a don. He greeted the inspector with the sort of courteous irritation one reserves for a customer likely to browse for half an hour, and then buy nothing. "Good afternoon, Mr. Scroggins. I wondered if you might cast your professional eye over a pair of spectacles that came into my possession," Pubright said, producing the broken pair. Scroggins examined them with a grunt. "Cheap. Mail order most likely, not supplied by any respectable establishment. One sees these advertised at the back of magazines. Postal business, no measurements, no decency. Whoever wore these was either careless or thrifty beyond reason." Pubright nodded, filing away the information. "And would you say they'd be much worn? I mean, do they suggest long use?" Scroggins turned the frame over in his fat fingers. "Indeed. See here, the greenish patina where the nose pads have reacted with perspiration. Years of use. Also, the bridge has been soldered at some point. Amateur work." The inspector thanked him, pocketed the spectacles again, and strolled out, apparently content. But as he walked down the high street, a small matter tugged at his thoughts. He recalled Mrs. Pallithorpe's handbag, placed primly at her side during the flower show. It had been closed. He remembered that distinctly, yet on the inside flap, as he pocketed the glasses, he had glimpsed a faint dusting of powder, face powder to be sure. Ordinary. But upon closer memory, not the pale pink or ivory ladies generally employed. This had been darker, faintly grey. By itself it was nothing. Face powder was hardly a rare commodity. But why, he wondered, had a faint smudge of the same tone lingered inside the spectacle case? He had not yet mentioned that to anyone, not even to Sergeant Malley. Later that evening, over a solitary plate of shepherd's pie at the Royal George, Pubright listened with patient detachment to the public's newest theories. "Mark my words," said Mr. Craggs, the retired postman, leaning across the table to a sceptical audience. "This is the work of a foreign agent. Why else the dark lenses, spying on us, no doubt." "A spy in Flaxborough?" chuckled another. "What would they be after, the secret of Mrs. Tubbins's rhubarb jam?" Pubright smiled into his pint, letting the talk wash over him. He was less interested in the spy theory than in a comment made by Mrs. Tubbins herself when she joined the company later. "Oh, I knew they weren't Mr. Winstanley's, not his size. His head's tiny, you know. You've only to see his hats to realise. That pair, why, they'd slip straight off his nose." It was an idle observation, made between gulps of port, but Pubright tucked it away. A detail, a trifling one. Yet trifles had a habit of leading somewhere. The following morning, Pubright asked Sergeant Malley to make a list, not of suspects, but of those who had been standing near Mrs. Pallithorpe at the moment of her shriek. Malley returned with a sheet of names scrawled in his heavy hand: Mr. Gribble, Councillor Chubb, and Mrs. Fawcett, competitor in the teacup arrangement class, and of course Mrs. Pallithorpe herself. Pubright read it over with quiet satisfaction. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is, sir?" asked Malley. "Oh, only that gossip tends to mention the guilty least. Let us see whom no one recalls, shall we?" Malley blinked. "But surely, sir, everyone's remembered somebody." "Not quite," said Pubright softly. "There was the tall man in the raincoat. Stooping, mothball scent. No one has attached a name to him. And yet, curiously, no one appears to wonder who he was." The sergeant frowned, puzzled. "Maybe just a stranger, sir, passing through." "Perhaps," Pubright agreed, smiling as he slipped the spectacles back into his drawer. But in his mind, the odd detail of the grey powder, the oversized frame, and the unremembered stooping man were beginning to draw together, like wisps of smoke that sooner or later would show where the fire lay. For now, though, he let the matter rest. A mystery in Flaxborough rarely hurried itself. It merely sat like an uninvited guest at tea until it became impossible to ignore. Friday morning brought with it a light drizzle, which in Flaxborough was regarded as less a meteorological inconvenience than a civic condition, rather like the rates or the state of the bus service. Inspector Pubright, umbrella in hand, allowed the rain to dictate his pace as he made his way along the high street. He had resolved that the time had come to enlarge the circle of his inquiries. His first call was at the drapery shop of Councillor Sweet. The shop was a long, faintly musty cavern of stacked bolts of fabric, where the councillor himself presided in a tape measure like a judge wearing his chain of office. "Inspector," he exclaimed, clearly delighted to play some role in the drama that continued to ripple through the town. "You'll want to know my impressions of Saturday's incident, of course. Shocking, shocking indeed, though between ourselves one wonders if it wasn't a little exaggerated." Purbright's brow lifted a fraction. "Exaggerated, councillor?" Sweet leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Palathorpe, you see, has a certain inclination towards display, never quite reconciled to widowhood in my view. Perfectly respectable woman, don't mistake me, but she does not object to attention. She was in my shop only last week inquiring about mourning silks. Silks, Inspector, though her late husband has been gone more than a year. I dare say a pair of old spectacles dropped near her handbag presented a theatrical opportunity." Pubright thanked him gravely, and made no comment. He had long learned that in Flaxborough, character assassinations were a local sport. From the drapery shop, he moved on to the little milliner's kept by Miss Dora Pepin, a woman of waspish neatness and a tongue that carried further than her voice intended. She was in the act of fitting a hat onto a long-suffering customer when Pubright stepped in, but she did not miss a beat. "Ah, Inspector, I suppose you're still untangling that nonsense with the widow Palathorpe. Mark my words, she'll have more to hide than she pretends. People do. She still gets letters, you know, foreign stamps. I've seen them in her hall when I've delivered millinery. She snatches them away quick enough, but not before one notices. And as for Saturday, I wouldn't be surprised if those spectacles belonged to one of her correspondents." The inspector expressed polite interest, then left Miss Pepin to her suspicions and hatpins. By mid-afternoon he had taken tea with Mrs. Fawcett, who had been close to the scene at the flower show. Mrs. Fawcett, stout and earnest, insisted that she had noticed nothing untoward, save that Mrs. Palathorpe had appeared, in her view, rather less startled than one might expect. All of these contributions were dutifully noted in Purbright's small, neat hand. None of them, he suspected, would prove true in the form given, but each hinted at little cross-currents beneath the surface of Flaxborough life. It was later, as he strolled past the lending library, that another thread appeared. The librarian, a thin man named Smeaton with a taste for classification bordering on mania, beckoned him in with the eagerness of one who has at last found an audience. "You'll be interested in this, Inspector. A man came in 2 weeks ago, unknown to me, asked for books on orchids. Orchids, mind you, which no one has ever requested here before. He wore a heavy raincoat, smelled of mothballs, stooped too as though hiding himself." Pubright listened without betraying the satisfaction he felt. The description, so casual, matched precisely the unnamed figure who had slipped through the flower show unnoticed. "Did you catch his name, Mr. Smeaton?" The librarian sniffed. "He signed the register as Brown." "A most unconvincing Brown. I know a Brown when I see one, Inspector." "And this was not he?" With that, Smeaton resumed his reshelving, clearly satisfied at having provided a contribution of weight to the investigation. That evening in the police station, Pubright set the reports side by side. A widow with foreign correspondence, a raincoat man researching orchids. a set of spectacles bought cheaply by mail order, long worn and clumsily repaired. And powder, dark, greyish powder, lingering where it had no obvious reason to be. He leaned back, eyes half closed. It was still too soon to tug the threads tight. But the field was widening. Each character, in their little disclosures and gossip, had furnished a piece of something larger. Sergeant Malley entered then, carrying the day's constable notes. "Another complaint about bicycles on the pavement, sir?" "Oh, and Mrs. Pallethorpe rang again. Says she's remembered seeing a shadow at the show. Wants to be sure you know she's still very nervous." Pubright smiled faintly. "And Mrs. Pallethorpe may rely upon my full attention, in due course." And as Malley left, the inspector returned his gaze to the spectacles on his desk, lying patiently in their brokenness, as though waiting for him to ask the right question. It was a fortnight later when the town was gifted another drama, though no one, except perhaps Mrs. Hatch from the post office, would have had the nerve to call it a tragedy. It began with a milk float, which in itself was innocent enough, trundling along the high street with its whirring battery motor and cheery clink of bottles. The float was being driven by young Lionel Gedge, a lad so permanently bewildered in expression that many doubted he was quite suited to the intricate arithmetic of pints and half-pints. On that morning, however, Lionel was not noticed for his deficiencies in arithmetic, but for the curious object that rattled loose from beneath his crates, a pair of black-lensed spectacles, their frames somewhat bent and one lens cracked across the middle. The lad, oblivious, continued on his rounds, but Mrs. Hatch, who was leaning from her doorway in a shawl and rollers, pounced upon the discovery like a cat upon a crippled mouse. By luncheon, half the town had heard of the find, and by tea-time the spectacles were firmly declared to be the very pair that poor Mr. Brimley had mislaid at the horticultural show. This was not quite accurate. Pubright himself had been shown the spectacles after Sergeant Love collected them from Mrs. Hatch's fiercely possessive keeping. He had turned them over thoughtfully in his hand, remarking only that the prescription appeared rather stronger than that which Mr. Brimley was known to require. Still, he did not contradict the spreading tale. Contradicting gossip, in his experience, was as sensible as sweeping back the North Sea with a coal shovel. By evening, the matter of the spectacles had expanded beyond optics into character speculation. If they were not Brimley's, then whose? More to the point, why had they been found crushed under the milk crates? Mrs. Hatch, perhaps enjoying the role of oracle, implied that they might have belonged to someone who ought never to have been creeping about gardens in the first place. This, in the delicate tongues of Flaxborough, was an accusation of something vaguely disreputable, though never quite defined. The next day brought an addition to the mystery. The widow, Mrs. Salter, she of the severe black dresses and the little terrier that barked at motorbikes, appeared at the police station. She carried, in a paper bag, a second pair of black spectacles, this set intact and of noticeably similar design. With that quiet dignity peculiar to widows who both scorn and relish being suspected, she announced that these had belonged to her late husband Godfrey and had been missing from her bureau drawer for the better part of a month. She had been reluctant to trouble the authorities earlier, she said, for fear of causing embarrassment. To whom precisely this embarrassment would have accrued, she did not clarify. Pubright, watching her carefully, asked if she had any idea how her husband's spectacles might have migrated to the high street. Mrs. Salter pressed her lips together as if containing some truth too indelicate for police ears, and suggested only that certain persons might have wished her no good. When pressed, she declined to name them, leaving Love to note down a statement more notable for what it avoided than what it contained. This second incident, first the discovery of broken spectacles, then the widow's peculiar appearance with their twin, stirred the town into delighted ferment. Councillor Trigg, over his lunchtime steak and kidney pudding at the Crown, declared it was high time the police admitted we had a case of burglary on our hands. The landlord's wife, who disliked Trigg, murmured that theft was hardly the same thing as mischief, but the councillor ignored her. He was already entertaining a picture of himself quoted in the Flaxborough Citizen, urging vigilance and resolution in the face of mounting disorder. Meanwhile, the town's amateur criminologists proposed their theories. Mr. Brimley confided to a friend at the barber's that the widow's husband had not been altogether devoted to her in life, and perhaps someone was stirring her memories maliciously. Mrs. Hatch, of course, hinted darkly at smuggling or continental connections. And Miss Teatime, who had been quiet thus far, expressed only mild amusement, observing that widows sometimes cherish their secrets more jealously than their husbands. For Pubright, the incidents carried weight not in their drama but in their timing. He had expected the Brimley affair to settle into obscurity. Such cases usually did when left to the soft erosion of town gossip. That it should suddenly be reanimated by the appearance of the spectacles suggested that someone, perhaps through malice, perhaps through clumsiness, was unwilling to let it die. That evening he took a quiet walk through the market square. The lamps were just lighting the shops shuttering one by one. He paused by the window of the optician's, where rows of spectacles gleamed beneath the glow of a single bulb. Each pair seemed faintly accusing, as though the glass eyes knew more than they would ever tell. Pubright did not smile, but his brows lifted in a way Sergeant Love had come to interpret as significant. The inspector was considering, not yet deducing, but considering that spectacles, like secrets, were rarely lost without someone noticing. The question was less how they had been misplaced and more why someone wished them to be found, and so the town, fed and watered by rumour, turned the simple matter of a cracked lens into a second incident, one that deepened shadows rather than dispelling them. The widow had spoken, the councillors speculated, and the milk lad would forever be known as the boy who delivered more than dairy. Whether or not the truth was within sight, however, remained uncertain. For Pubright, the spectacles were not the end of the mystery, but the beginning of its clearer shape. Inspector Pubright, who seldom permitted himself the luxury of hurrying, had at last been able to leave the day's clutter of interviews behind and retreat to the small sanctuary of his office. The room had about it a comfortable shabbiness, as though the very wallpaper had grown resigned to decades of patient officialdom. Here, with the blinds half drawn against the golden lamplight of the evening and the faint whir of the police station's heating system in the background, he allowed himself the indulgence of thinking without the necessity of speaking. His notes, compiled neatly in his careful hand, lay spread before him like a series of quiet conversations captured on paper. Names, times, seemingly irrelevant digressions, the peculiar things people chose to volunteer, and the equally telling things they left unsaid, all were arranged not as a chronology, but as a sort of landscape through which Pubright ambled in his mind. What struck him, as always in such investigations, was not the fact of a crime in itself. Flaxborough had over the years produced thefts, frauds, even the occasional burst of passion. What absorbed him was the way ordinary people managed their reputations in the shadow of wrongdoing. The town, after all, ran on a constant economy of appearances. To preserve the fiction of serenity, its citizens told each other small lies of omission, dressed up their motives in propriety, and hinted slyly at their neighbours' defects, while keeping their own decorously veiled. The Black Spectacles affair, as it was already being referred to by Mrs. Arcott in her shop doorway, had revealed once more the delicate balance between secrecy and gossip. Why should spectacles, even of curious hue, arouse such energy? Why, too, did a widow's nervousness about their appearance in her possession seem to attract more delight than compassion among her fellows? Pubright suspected the answer lay less in the object itself than in the relief it afforded the town, a chance to speculate about another person's shame and thereby distract from one's own. There were facts, certainly, that tugged at him with persistence. Miss Lucilla Pardy's eagerness to describe Mrs. Beamish's late husband's supposed habits. Why had she dwelt so much on the matter of male company at the door? The overgroomed bank clerk, Mr. Chudley, who had made a performance of disclaiming any knowledge, was the performance itself the thing to be remembered. And quietly in the background, the note of unease in Mrs. Beamish's voice when she attempted to dismiss the spectacles as a curiosity that had no connection to her life. Still more intriguing was the nature of the second incident, if it could yet be called that. A whispered suggestion that papers had gone missing from a solicitor's drawer, papers concerning a will. The town had not yet decided whose will, but this had not prevented the elaboration of complicated theories linking it to the glasses. Pubright allowed himself a faint smile at the inventiveness of provincial speculation. But behind the smile lingered a thought that the town, in its clumsy way, was circling close to something true. It was the alignment of trifles where the spectacles had appeared, when Mrs. Beamish had been seen returning late from a church meeting, how Mr. Chudley had misremembered his own diary entries, that seemed to whisper at the inspector. He knew enough to trust such whispers. He folded his hands, looked at the ceiling with its faint bloom of damp, and wondered, as he often did, whether crime was not best understood as a branch of social etiquette gone awry. People offended not only against the law, but against the unspoken code of what might be politely concealed. When concealment failed, they grew desperate, clumsy, and sometimes cruel. Pubright sighed softly, rose from his chair, and gathered his papers. He felt no closer to the truth in a declarative sense, but he had, in his quiet reflections, sketched the outline of a human frailty upon which the truth might one day alight. Tomorrow there would be another conversation, another hint given unawares, another moment when the guilty party's mask might slip. For now the town could sleep, safe in the illusion of its own innocence. Pubright, with the patient skepticism of long practice, would wait for the moment when illusion faltered, as it always did. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear over Flaxborough, the kind of light that made the dew glint on rooftops and encouraged townsfolk to step gingerly along the uneven paving stones. Inspector Pubright, however, was not concerned with either glint or unevenness. He was concerned with observation, the subtle shifts in human behaviour that revealed more than words ever could. His first task was deliberate, yet outwardly casual. He visited Mrs. Beamish, ostensibly to return her spectacles for safekeeping, while the police completed their inquiries. The widow received him with her usual combination of courtesy and faint nervousness. "Inspector, how very kind of you," she said, taking the spectacles into her hands. She turned them over, as if performing a ritual of inspection, then placed them delicately on the lace cloth atop the side table. Pubright studied her, choosing his moment with care. "Mrs. Beamish, do you recall the powder I noticed on the inside of the case when I first examined it?" Her lips parted slightly, a micro-expression almost invisible. "Powder?" she murmured, almost as if testing whether he might withdraw the remark. "Yes, a greyish powder, faint but discernible." Pubright's tone was polite, casual, almost idle. "I wondered whether perhaps you had an idea how it came to be there." She straightened, tensing imperceptibly. I really cannot imagine, Inspector. I do not wear powders of that kind." Pubright nodded as if accepting her answer, but remained in the room a few moments longer, discussing the flower show, the orchids, and the curious ways in which plants sometimes seemed more troublesome than people. It was the sort of conversation designed to lull, to give the illusion of normalcy, while he watched every gesture, every subtle twitch of the eyes and fingers. Next, he made a brief stop at the Royal George, where Mr. Gribble had insisted upon a quick chat about the town's current mood. Gribble, confident in his own moral and civic authority, spoke volubly about how the town demanded resolution, though he had no more evidence than anyone else. Pubright listened and remarked only occasionally, steering the conversation with mild observations. "I wonder, Mr. Gribble, if townsfolk sometimes enjoy the suspense more than the revelation. One sees it with literature, one sees it with flowers, and occasionally one sees it with spectacles." Gribble blinked, unsure whether he had been complimented or mildly reproached, and the inspector let the comment hang. It was not until the late afternoon that Pubright executed the crucial part of his test. He arranged for a casual meeting at the optician's, ostensibly to discuss minor repairs to Mrs. Beamish's spectacles. Mrs. Beamish, curious but unsuspecting, arrived with her handbag neatly pressed beneath her arm. Pubright allowed the conversation to meander toward the flower show, asking innocent questions about timing, placement, and the people present. Then, without drama, he mentioned Mr. Chudley, the bank clerk, who had been near the widow at the moment the spectacles were first noticed. The effect was immediate. Mrs. Beamish stiffened, glanced at the window, then at the floor, and murmured, I had not thought—" Her voice trailed off. "Perhaps it is nothing," Pubright said softly, almost apologetically. "But you see, one tends to remember those moments differently when under observation. People, especially careful people, sometimes reveal more when they believe it is merely incidental." The widow shifted, her hands clasping tightly around her handbag. She began to recount a visit from a certain gentleman who had arrived under the pretext of delivering documents. Purbright's expression remained benign, neutral, as she confessed that she had been startled by the presence of a man in dark spectacles, the very sort she had reported at the show. By the time she paused, catching her breath, Pubright simply nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Beamish. That is very helpful. I think we now understand the peculiar circumstances surrounding both pairs of spectacles." There was no triumph in his voice, no dramatic flourish. He merely returned the widow's spectacles to her, set his own hat on his head, and walked quietly out into the crisp evening. The test had been subtle, civil, and perfectly polite. Yet it had unsettled the guilty party sufficiently to allow the truth to emerge naturally, without coercion. Sergeant Love, waiting in the station, followed him as Pubright crossed the square. "Sir?" he asked, curious. "Do we have the culprit, then?" Purbright's lips twitched with the faintest trace of a smile. "Patience, Sergeant. We have something far more useful than a culprit at last. We have honesty, and from honesty one rarely requires anything else." The town, unsuspecting, continued its evening routines. The lamps glimmered on the wet cobbles, the milk float rattled down the high street, and the windows glowed with the quiet contentment of people unaware that the puzzle was almost complete. It was late on Saturday afternoon when Inspector Pubright finally gathered the key figures in the tidy back room of the Royal George. The room smelled faintly of tea and polished wood, a comforting scent that contrasted sharply with the subtle tension hovering among the assembled townsfolk. The widow, Mrs. Beamish, sat with her gloves folded neatly in her lap. Sergeant Love stood near the door, alert but unobtrusive, and Mr. Gribble, Councillor Sweet, and Miss Pepin filled the remaining chairs with polite curiosity. Pubright, as always, appeared unhurried. He moved toward the centre of the room, deliberately adjusting his hat, and took a moment to survey the faces of those who had speculated, gossiped, and nearly convicted in absentia. Then in his most civil tone he began, "Ladies and gentlemen, and Mr. Gribble, I think it is now appropriate to discuss what actually transpired at the flower show 2 weeks ago." He paused, allowing the suspense to settle comfortably into the room without rushing. As you know, Mrs. Beamish discovered a pair of broken spectacles. These, as we first supposed, were mysterious in origin. The town, in its natural curiosity, attached them to several people, most notably Mr. Winstanley, whose eccentricity is as familiar as the cobbles on the high street. However, as our inquiries continued, several details began to suggest a different story. He gestured toward the spectacles, now carefully restored to their place on the side table. Firstly, we have the powder, greyish, faint, and, as it turns out, typical of a substance used to preserve certain delicate documents. Secondly, the owner. The spectacles were indeed old, repaired with care, and frequently used by someone who wished to handle them with discretion. Thirdly, the movements on the day of the flower show. Our observations, coupled with the reports from the lending library and Mrs. Pepin, point not to a habitual eccentric or an ill-intentioned neighbour, but to a single visitor. He paused again, letting the room absorb the deliberate weight of his phrasing. "That visitor," he continued, "was none other than the widow herself, Mrs. Beamish. The spectacles had belonged to her late husband, Mr. Godfrey Beamish. She had borrowed them from their usual resting place to settle a small domestic account of correspondence, and in doing so accidentally left traces of powder on the case and elsewhere. Her alarm at finding them near the orchid display was genuine, but the notion that another party had caused it, well, that was born of her own memory playing tricks in the excitement of the day." There was a soft gasp from Mrs. Beamish, though her composure remained remarkably intact. Pubright continued with the gentlest of smiles. "The raincoat man, mentioned by several of you, was a minor misperception, a library visitor who coincidentally sought books on orchids. Mr. Winstanley, as we verified, had not mislaid or broken any spectacles, nor had Mr. Brimley. In truth, the affair was a series of coincidental errors, magnified by the town's enthusiasm for speculation and narrative." He turned to Sergeant Love. "I trust, Sergeant, that the milk float incident is also clear. The second pair of spectacles was brought forward by Mrs. Salter, and likewise unrelated to any deliberate wrongdoing. The coincidence is remarkable, but not criminal." Mrs. Beamish, after a delicate pause, nodded slowly. "I see. So all this fuss, it was simply my own carelessness, Inspector?" "Indeed," said Pubright, inclining his head with that polite gravity he carried so well. "But carelessness can resemble intent in the right circumstances, especially in a town that enjoys conjecture. No harm was intended and no malice was present. What we have witnessed is the remarkable creativity of human error, amplified by social attention." Mr. Gribble cleared his throat. "So then the town may rest assured that there was no nefarious activity, no criminal at large?" "Exactly so," Pubright said, with the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "The mystery lay not in the spectacles themselves, but in the stories we told around them. The truth is often quieter and far less dramatic than our imaginations might suggest. And in Flaxborough that is precisely the point. Reality, like the flowers, persists in its own order, regardless of how loudly we narrate it." The room remained quiet for a few moments, the tension slowly yielding to relief and, in some cases, embarrassed amusement. Mrs. Beamish, the widow, adjusted her gloves and smiled faintly at the inspector. Pubright inclined his head politely, gathering the spectacles for final inspection before returning them to their proper place. There was no triumph, no flourish, only the calm satisfaction that comes from understanding, and the knowledge that the town's sense of order would soon resume, unhindered. Outside, the high street continued its evening rituals, with the lamps casting long shadows and the faint bustle of pedestrians and milk floats continuing undisturbed. Inside, the mystery was complete, and the fragile web of human curiosity and imagination had unravelled quietly, civilly, without injury. By Sunday morning, Flaxborough had resumed its usual rhythms, and the town breathed once again in the comfortable cadence of small rituals and minor routines. The milk float rattled past with its predictable clatter. The postman delivered letters with his customary half-smile, and the newspaper boys, their cries echoing down the cobbles, carried news that mattered far less than the gossip it might inspire. The Black Spectacles affair, which had grown in imagination and conjecture to a drama of quasi-criminal proportions, had settled into the quiet obscurity of an honest mistake. The townsfolk, with a mixture of relief and lingering curiosity, had moved on to other matters: the relative merits of rhubarb pies at the market, the peculiar attitude of Mr. Winstanley toward orchids, and the likely outcomes of the upcoming council meeting. Mrs. Beamish, the widow, displayed a discreet serenity. She took her daily walks with her terrier, her spectacles safely tucked into a case now free of powder or misunderstanding. She nodded politely to those who remembered the incident without feeling obliged to dwell on her own embarrassment. For Flaxborough, scandal had passed, leaving only the quiet moral satisfaction that it had survived another curious challenge. In the police station, Pubright returned to his desk with a cup of weak tea, careful not to disturb the order of files, ledgers, and the small heap of letters awaiting attention. Sergeant Love, ever alert, lingered nearby, ready for the next instruction, though knowing well that the moment to act had passed. Pubright leaned back in his chair, resting his hands upon the desk. The town had provided him with gossip, misdirection, and minor falsehoods, but it had also revealed truth in fragments, the subtle details, the tiny inconsistencies, the unwitting admissions that only careful observation could reveal. It was the town itself, in its ordinary humanity, that had whispered the solution. He made a few final notes, documenting what had occurred, but with his characteristic restraint, he avoided any unnecessary flourish. There was no need to dramatize the events. The quiet resolution spoke more eloquently than any words could. As he looked out through the window at the slowly brightening streets, he noted the familiar gestures of everyday life: the baker arranging his loaves, the grocer stacking apples with meticulous care, the children practicing skipping in the square. These small details, so easily overlooked, held the patterns of the town together just as surely as law or order. The Black Spectacles affair would, in time, become one of those stories told at tea tables, embroidered with exaggeration by those who liked a touch of drama, yet rooted in nothing more serious than human curiosity and a widow's minor distraction. Pubright allowed himself the faintest smile at the thought. Flaxborough would remain Flaxborough, orderly in its eccentricity, vigilant in its gossip, and quietly delightful in its small-scale mysteries. And so the inspector, having watched the last act play out with patience and civility, returned to his quiet paperwork. The town went on none the worse for the episode, and the pattern of its daily life resumed with gentle certainty. There would be other oddities, other trifles, other spectacles lost or misremembered, but for now there was peace,